Archmage or not, my rules about books still stand. Very funny. Did Enter put you up to this? You? Really? An Elder Scroll? I would be honored, beyond honored, to have such a thing here at the college. This opens up entire new realms of research for us. Oh, if only Septimus were here to see this. Thank you. Please, take this. It can't quite compare to an Elder Scroll, but still, you will be remembered for generations for this. We were able to figure out the last text you brought in. I thought the least I could do is pass the knowledge along. Assorted books, scrolls. I'm sure you'll find something useful. And what do you plan to do with it? Do you even know what you're asking about? Or are you just someone's errand boy? You think that even if I did have one here, I would let you see it? It would be kept under the highest security. The greatest thief in the world wouldn't be able to lay a finger on it. What about... Wait. Were you the one the Greybeards were calling? I'll bring everything we have on them, but it's not much. So don't get your hopes up. It's mostly lies, leavened with rumor and conjecture.
Restoration is a perfectly valid school of magic, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You consider Restoration a valid school of magic, worthy of study, don't you? Don't you? Good, good. Not that I require validation, of course. There are just some, and I shan't name names, who would disagree. It can make life difficult when one's colleagues fail to recognize the research one engages in. Well, no, not really. Not directly, I mean. But I know things are being said behind my back. Conversations cease when I enter rooms. I'm quite aware of what's going on here, and I will not stand for it. Spells and incantations for those with a talent to cast them.
Writ of Sealing. A writ for the sealing away of Sigdus Galderson. Be bound here, Sigdus, murderer, betrayer, condemned by your crimes against realm and lord. May your name and your deeds be forgotten forever, and the charm which you bear be sealed by our ward.
Then
Writ of Sealing. A writ for the sealing away of Mikruel Galderson. Be bound here, Mikruel, murderer, betrayer, condemned by your crimes against realm and lord. May your name and your deeds be forgotten forever, and the charm which you bear be sealed by our ward.
The Ethereum Wars by Teron Dreth, a treatise on the collapse of Dwemer city-states in Skyrim, dedicated to Ketria, my friend and colleague. The end, when it came, was swift. In the span of 3 short years, the great dwarven cities of Skyrim, from Markarth to Velothi mountains, fell before the armies of the High King. Cities that had held fast against the Nords for over 100 years crumbled abruptly and without warning. For centuries, scholars have marveled at the sudden collapse of the Dwemer city-states. Even the Nords seem to have been taken by surprise, though their chronicles were quick to ascribe their success to King Gellius' inspired tactics and the blessings of Shor. My research suggests a much different course, however. In the decades preceding their fall, the dwarven cities of Skyrim had been decimated by internal disputes and infighting over the most surprising cause, Ethereum. Modern scholars know Ethereum as a rare, luminescent blue crystal found in some Dwemer ruins. Most consider it little more than a curiosity, as it has proven all but impossible to work with. While it has a strong magical aura, it is alchemically inert, and no known processes can enchant, smelt, mold, bind, or break it. To the dwarves, of course, such problems were merely challenges. In the years following King Harald's reign, the Dwemer discovered a considerable source of Ethereum in their deepest dwellings. An alliance of 4 cities led by Arkhantams, the great research center in the southern reach, was formed to oversee its extraction, processing and study, and a new successful Ethereum forge constructed to smelt it under precisely conditions. If the inscriptions I discovered are to be believed, the results were nothing short of spectacular. The items produced by the forge were artifacts of immense power, imbued from the moment of their creation with powerful enchantments. The Dwarven alliance shattered almost immediately, as the 4 city-states and their rivals attempted to claim the forge. We can only speculate that none were successful. Decades of conflict merely weakened them all, allowing for King Gellius' subsequent conquests. And though the Dwemer reclaimed most of their lands a century later, there is no evidence that they ever resumed the research on Ethereum. Perhaps the cost had just been too great. But nothing like the Ethereum forge described in the inscriptions has ever been found within the borders of Skyrim. It may have been destroyed long ago, by the Nord invaders or the Dwemer themselves. Or perhaps it, like the city of Ethereum itself, still remains to be discovered.
Report. Disaster at Ionith by Lord Potreed, Chairman. An Imperial scripted dispatch concerning Uriel V's invasion of Akavir. Part 1. Preparations. The Emperor's plans for the invasion of Akavir were laid in the 270s, when he began the conquest of the small island kingdoms that lie between Tamriel and Akavir. With the fall of Black Harbor and Esronius in 282, Imperial Fire was already looking ahead to the ultimate prize. He immediately ordered extensive preparations, which would serve as the logical point for the invasion and as the main supply source. At this time, he also began the construction of the many large ocean-going transports that would be needed for the final crossing to Akavir, in which the Navy was previously deficient. Thus it can be seen that the Emperor's preparations for the invasion were laid well in advance, even before the conquest of Esroniet was complete, and was not a sudden whim, as some have charged. When Prince Bashaman yielded Esroniet to Imperial authority in 284, the Emperor's full attention could be devoted to planning for the Akaviri campaign. Naval expeditions were dispatched in 285 and 286 to scout the sea lanes and coastlands of Akavir, and various Imperial intelligence agents, both magical and mundane, were employed to gather information. On the basis of all this information, the kingdom of the Saieskis in the southwest of Akavir was selected as the initial target for the invasion. Meanwhile, the Emperor was gathering his expeditionary force. A new Far East fleet was created for the campaign, which, for a time, dwarfed the rest of the Navy. It is said to be the most powerful fleet ever assembled in the history of Tamriel. 5th, 7th, 10th, 14th legions were selected for the initial landing, with the 9th and 17th to follow as reinforcements once the beachhead was secured. While this may seem to the layman a relatively small fraction of the army's total manpower, it must be remembered that this expeditionary force would have to be maintained at the end of a long and tenuous supply line. In addition, the Emperor and the army command believed that the invasion would not be strongly opposed, at least at first. Perhaps more crucially, the Navy had only enough heavy transport capacity to move 4 legions at a time. It should be noted here that the Commission does not find fault with the Emperor's preparations for the invasion. Based on the information available prior to the invasion, which, while obviously deficient in hindsight, great effort had been made to accumulate, the Commission believes that the Emperor did not act recklessly or imprudently. Some have argued that the expeditionary force was too small. The Commission believes that, on the contrary, even if shipping could have been found to transport and supply more legions, an impossibility without crippling the trade of the entire empire, this would have merely added to the scale of the disaster. It would not have averted it. Neither could the rest of the empire be denuded of legions. The memory of the Comoran usurper was still fresh, and the Emperor believed, and this commission agrees, that the security of the empire precluded a large concentration of military force outside of Tamriel. If anything, the commission believes that the expeditionary force was too large. Despite the creation of 2 new legions during his reign, and the recreation of the 5th, the loss of the expeditionary force left the empire in a dangerously weak position relative to the provinces, as the current situation makes all too clear. This suggests that the invasion of Akavir is beyond the Empire's current strength. Even if the Emperor had fielded and maintained a larger force in Akavir, the Empire may have disintegrated behind it. Report. Disaster at Island. Lord TonyTheWhite, Chairman. Imperial scripted dispatch concerning Imperial 5's invasion. Part 2. Invasion of Akavir. The expeditionary force left Black Harbor on 23rd Rain's Hand for the invasion. With fair weather, landed in Akavir after 6 weeks at sea. The landing site was a small Saiski port at the mouth of a large river, chosen for its proximity to Tamriel, as well as its location in a fertile river valley, giving easy access to the interior, as well as good foraging for the army. All went well, at first. The Saiski had abandoned the town when the expeditionary force approached, so they took possession of it and renamed it Septimia, the first colony of the new imperial province of Akavir. While the engineers fortified the town and expanded the port facilities to serve the Far East Fleet, the Emperor marched inland with 2 legions. The surrounding land was reported to be rich, well-watered fields, and meeting no resistance, the army took the next city upriver, also abandoned. This was refounded as Ionith, and the Emperor established his headquarters here, being much larger than Septimia, and better located to dominate the surrounding countryside. The expeditionary force had yet to meet any real resistance, resistance, although the legions were constantly shadowed by mounted enemy patrols which prevented any but large scouting parties from leaving the main body of the army. One thing the Emperor sorely lacked was cavalry, due to the limited space on the transport fleet, although for the time being the battle mages made up for this with magical reconnaissance. The Emperor now sent out envoys to try to contact the Sieski king or whoever ruled this land, but his messengers never returned. In retrospect, the Commission believes that valuable time was wasted in this effort while the army was stalled at Ionith, which could have been better spent in advancing quickly while the enemy was still, apparently, surprised by the invasion. However, the Emperor believed at the time that the Sieski would be overawed by the Empire's power, and he might win a province by negotiation, with no need for serious fighting. Meanwhile, the four legions were busy building a road between Septimia and Ionith, setting up fortified guard posts along the river, and fortifying both cities' defenses, activities which would serve them well later. Due to their lack of cavalry, scouting was limited, and communication between the two cities constantly threatened by enemy raiders, with which the legions were still unable to come to grips. The original plan had been to bring the two reinforcing legions across as soon as the initial landing had secured a port, but the fateful decision was now taken to delay their arrival and instead begin using the fleet to transport colonists. The Emperor and the Council agreed that, due to the complete abandonment of the conquered area by its native population, colonists were needed to work the fields so that the expeditionary force would not have to rely entirely on the fleet for supplies. In addition, unrest had broken out in Ineslia, athwart the supply route to Akavir, and the Council believed the 9th and 17th Legions would be better used in repacifying these territories and securing the expeditionary force's supply lines. The civilian colonists and their supplies began arriving in Septimia in mid-Hearthfire, and they took over the preparation of the fields, which had been started by the Legionnaires, for a spring crop. A number of cavalry mounts were also brought over at this time, and the raids on the two imperial colonies subsequently fell off. Sieski emissaries also finally arrived in Ionith, purportedly to begin peace negotiations, and the expeditionary force settled in for what was expected to be a quiet winter. At this time, the Council urged the Emperor to return to Tamriel with the fleet, to deal with many pressing matters of the Empire while the army was in winter quarters, but the Emperor decided that it would be best to remain in Akavir. This turned out to be fortunate, because a large portion of the fleet, including the Emperor's flagship, was destroyed by an early winter storm during the homeward voyage. The winter storm season of 288 and 289 was unusually prolonged and exceptionally severe, and prevented the fleet from returning to Akavir as planned with additional supplies. This was reported to the Emperor via Battle Mage, and it was agreed that the expeditionary force could survive on what supplies it had on hand until the spring. Report: Disaster at Ionith by Lord Pottery, Chairman. An Imperial scripted dispatch concerning Uriel V's invasion of Akavir. Part 3: The destruction of the expeditionary force. The winter weather in Akavir was also much more severe than expected. Due to the supply problems and the addition of thousands of civilians, the expeditionary force was on tight rations. To make matters worse, the Sieski raiders returned in force and harried any foraging and scouting parties outside the walls of the two cities. Several watch forts on the road between Septimia and Ionith were captured during blizzards, and the rest had to be abandoned as untenable. As a result, communication between the two cities had to be conducted entirely by magical means, continuing strain on the Legion's battlefield. On Fifth Sun's dawn, a large entourage of Sieski arrived at Ionith, claiming to bring a peace offer from the Sieski king. That night, these treacherous envoys murdered the guards at one of the city gates, and let in a strong party of their comrades who were waiting outside the city walls. Their clear intention was to assassinate the Emperor, foiled only by the vigilance and courage of troopers of the 10th who were guarding his palace. Once the alarm was raised, the Sieski inside the city were hunted down and killed to the last man. Needless to say, this was the end of negotiations between the Emperor and the Sieski. The arrival of spring only brought worse troubles. Instead of the expected spring rains, a hot, dry wind began to blow from the east, continuing with varying strength through the entire summer. The crops failed, and even the river, which in the previous year had been navigable by small boats far upstream of Ionith, was completely dried up by sun's height. It is unknown if this was due to a previously unknown weather pattern unique to Akavir, or if the Sieski manipulated the weather through magical means. The Commission leans towards the former conclusion, as there is no direct evidence of the Sieski possessing such fearsome arcane power, but the latter possibility cannot be entirely ruled out. Due to prolonged bad weather, the supply fleet was late in setting out from Black Harbor. It finally left port in early Second Seed, but was again severely mauled by storms and limped into Septimia 8 weeks later, much reduced. Because of the increasingly desperate supply situation in Akavir, the Emperor dispatched most of his battle mage corps with the fleet to assist it in weathering the storms which seemed likely to continue all summer. At this time, the Council urged the Emperor to abandon the invasion and to return to Tamriel with the expeditionary force, but he again refused, noting that the fleet was no longer large enough to transport all 4 legions at once. The Commission agrees that leaving 1 or more legions behind in Akavir to await the return of the fleet would have damaged army morale. But the Commission also notes that the loss of 1 legion would have been preferable to the loss of the entire expeditionary force. It is the unanimous opinion of the Commission that this was the last point at which complete disaster might have been averted. Once the decision was made to send the fleet back for reinforcements and supplies, events proceeded to their inevitable conclusion. From this point on, much less is known about what transpired in Akavir. With most of the battle mages assisting the fleet, communication between the expeditionary force and Tamriel was limited, especially as the situation in Akavir worsened and the remaining battle mages had their powers stretched to the limit, attending to all the needs of the legions. However, it appears that the Sieski may have also been actively interfering with the mages in some unknown manner. Some of the mages in Akavir reported their powers being abnormally weak, and the mages of the War College in Cyrodiil, who were handling communications for the Council, reported problems linking up with their compatriots in Akavir, even between master and pupil of long training. The Commission urges that the War College make a particular study of the arcane powers of the Sieski, should the Empire ever come into conflict with Akavir again. What is known is that the Emperor marched out of Ionith in mid-sun's height, leaving only small garrisons to hold the cities. He had learned that the Sieski were amassing their forces on the other side of a mountain range to the north, and he intended to smash their army before it could gather full strength and capture their supplies, of which he was in desperate need. This rapid advance seems to have taken the Sieski by surprise, and the expeditionary force crossed the mountains and fell onto their camp, routing the Sieski army and capturing its leader, a nobleman of some kind. But the Emperor was soon forced to retreat, and the legions suffered heavily on their retreat to Ionith. The Emperor now found himself besieged in Ionith, cut off from the small garrison at Septimia, which was also besieged. By this time, it seems that the efforts of the few remaining battle mages were devoted entirely to creating water to keep the army alive, a skill not normally emphasized at the War College. The fleet had arrived safely back to Black Harbor thanks to the Battle Mage Corps, but all attempts to return to Akavir were frustrated by a series of ever more savage storms that battered Esroniad throughout the rest of 289. The Council's last contact with the Emperor was in early frostfall. By Evening Star, the Council was extremely worried about the situation in Akavir and ordered the fleet to sail regardless of the risk. Despite the continued storms, the fleet managed to press on to Akavir. Hope was raised when contact was made with the Emperor's battle mage, who reported that Ionith still held out. Plans were quickly laid for the expeditionary force to break out of Ionith and fall back on Septimia, where the fleet would meet them. This was the last direct contact with the expeditionary force. The fleet arrived in Septimia to find its garrison under savage assault from a large Sieski army. The battle mages of the fleet threw back the enemy long enough for the survivors to embark and the fleet to withdraw. The few survivors of the expeditionary force who reached Septimia told how the Emperor had led the army out of Ionith by night 2 days earlier, successfully breaking through the enemy lines, but then being surrounded by overwhelming forces on the road to Septimia. They told of a heroic last stand by the Emperor and the 10th Legion, which allowed a remnant of the 14th to reach Septimia. 2 survivors of the 10th arrived in Septimia that night, having slipped through the enemy lines during their undisciplined victory celebrations. These men confirmed having seen the Emperor die, cut down by enemy arrows as he rallied the 10th's shield wall. Report: Disaster at Ionith by Lord Potreed, Chairman. an Imperial scripted dispatch concerning Uriel V's invasion of Akavir. Part 4. Conclusion. The Commission believes that the invasion of Akavir was doomed from the start for several reasons, none of which could have been foreseen beforehand, unfortunately. Despite the extensive intelligence gathering, the expeditionary force was clearly unprepared for the situation in Akavir. The unexpected weather, which plagued the army and navy, was particularly disastrous. Without the loss of a majority of the Far East fleet during the campaign, the expeditionary force could have been withdrawn in 289. The weather also forced the Emperor to assign most of his battle mage corps to the fleet, leaving him without their valuable assistance during the fighting which soon followed. And of course, the unexpected drought which struck Aynith during 289 dashed the hopes of supplying the army locally, and left the expeditionary force in an untenable situation when besieged in Aynith. The Sieski were also much stronger than intelligence reports had suggested. Information on the size of the army the Sieski were eventually able to field against the expeditionary force is vague, as the only serious fighting took place after regular communications were cut off between the Emperor and the Council. Nevertheless, it seems likely that the Sieski outnumbered the Emperor's forces by several times, as they were able to force 4 crack legions into retreat and then keep them under siege for several months. As was stated previously, the Commission declines to criticize the initial decision to invade Akavir. Based on what was known at the time, the plan seems sound. It is only with the benefit of hindsight does it become obvious that the invasion had very little chance of success. Nevertheless, the Commission believes several valuable lessons can be taken from this disaster. First, the Sieski may have extremely powerful arcane forces at their command. The possibility that they may have manipulated the weather across such a vast region seems incredible, and it should be noted that 3 commissioners strongly objected to this paragraph even being included in this report. But the Commission believes this matter deserves urgent investigation. The potential danger is such that even the slight possibility must be taken seriously. Second, the Sieski appear to possess no navy to speak of. The expeditionary force was never threatened by sea, and the Far East fleet fought nothing but the weather. Indeed, the initial plans called for a portion of the fleet to remain in Akavir for use in coastal operations, but in the event there were very few places where the large vessels of the fleet could approach the land, due to the innumerable reefs, sandbars, and islands, etc., that infested the coastal waters north and south from Septimia. Due to the utter lack of trees in the plain around Septimia and Iolith, the expeditionary force was unable to build smaller vessels, which could have navigated the shallow coastal waters. Any future military expeditions against Akavir would do well to consider some way of bringing a means for inshore naval operations in order to exploit this clear advantage over the Sieski, an advantage that was sadly unexploited by the expeditionary force. Third, a much longer-term study needs to be made of Akavir before another invasion could even be contemplated. The information gathered over the 4 years prior to the invasion was extensive, but clearly inadequate. The weather conditions were completely unexpected, the Sieski much stronger than expected, and the attempted negotiations by the Emperor with the Sieski a disaster. Akavir proved alien beyond expectation, and the Commission believes any future attempt to invade Akavir should not be contemplated without much greater knowledge of the conditions, politics, and peoples of that continent than previously obtained. Finally, the Commission unanimously concludes that given what we now know, any attempt to invade Akavir is folly, at least in the present state of the Empire. The Empire's legions are needed at home. One day, a peaceful, united Empire will return to Akavir and exact severe retribution for the disaster at Ioneth and for our fallen Emperor. But that day is not now, nor is it in the foreseeable future.
But he died over 200 years ago when the Red Mountain leveled the place. There's no way he could still be alive. If General Carius is still alive, there must be something keeping him that way. I need you to head out to Fort Frostmoth and check it out. I'm going to head back to Raven Rock and prepare the men for further assaults. Be careful. This General Carius sounds out of his mind.
The Argonian Account, Book 1, by Wagi and Yark. Decimus Scotti's Continued Adventures in Blackmarsh, Volume 1. On a minor but respectable plaza in the Imperial City sat, or perhaps lounged, Lord Vannick's building commission. It was an unimaginative, austere building, not noted so much for its aesthetic or architectural design as for its prodigious length. If any critics wondered why such an unornamented, extended erection held such fascination for Lord Vannick, they kept it to themselves. In the 398th year of the Third Era, Decimus Scotti was a senior clerk at this commission. It had been a few months since the shy, middle-aged man had brought Lord Vannick the most lucrative of all contracts, granting the commission the exclusive right to rebuild the roads of Valenwood, which has been destroyed in the 5-year war. For this, he had become the darling of the managers and the clerks, spending his days recounting his adventures, more or less faithfully, although he did omit the ending of the tale, since many of them had partaken in the celebratory Unthrapa roast provided by the Silent Estuary. Informing one's listeners that they've gorged on human flesh improves very few stories of any good taste. Scotti was neither particularly ambitious nor hard-working, so he did not mind that Lord Vannick had not given him anything to actually do. Whenever the squat, little gnomish man would happen upon Decimus Scotti in the offices, Lord Vannick would always say, "You're a credit to the commission. Keep up the good work." In the beginning, Scotti had worried that he was supposed to be doing something, but as the months went on, he merely replied, "Thank you, I will." There was, on the other hand, the future to consider. He was not a young man, and though he was receiving a respectable salary for someone not doing actual work, Scotti considered that soon he might have to retire and not get paid for not doing work. It would be nice, he decided, if Lord Vannick, out of gratitude for the millions of gold the Valenwood contract was generating, might deign to make Scotti a partner, or at least give him a small percentage of the bounty. Decimus Scotti was no good at asking for things like that, which was one of the reasons why, previous to his signal successes in Valenwood as a senior clerk for Lord Atreus, he was a lousy agent. He had just about made up his mind to say something to Lord Vannick when his lordship unexpectedly pushed things along. "You're a credit to the commission," the waddling little thing said, and then paused. "Do you have a moment free on your schedule?" Scotti nodded eagerly and followed his lordship to his hideously decorated and very enviable hectare of office space. "Xanathar blesses us for your presence at the commission," the fellow squeaked grandly. "I don't know whether you know this, but we were having a bad time before you came along. We had impressive projects, for certain, but they weren't that successful. In Blackmarsh, for example, for years we've been trying to improve the roads and other routes of travel and commerce. I put my best man, Lucius Keel, on it, but every year, despite staggering investments of time and money, the trade along those routes only gets slower and slower. Now, we have your very clean, very profitable Valenwood contract to boost the commission's profits. I think it's time you do it." Scotti grinned a grin of great modesty and subtle eyes. "I want you to take over the Blackmarsh account with Fuss's team." Scotti shook, as if awaking from a pleasant dream to a hideous reality. "My lord, I couldn't." "Nonsense," chirped Lord Vannick. "Don't worry about Tio. He'll be happy to retire on the money I give him, particularly as soul-wrenchingly difficult as this Blackmarsh business has been. Just your sort of challenge, my dear Decimus." Scotti couldn't utter a sound, though his mouth feebly formed the word "no" as Lord Vannick brought out the box of documentation on Blackmarsh. "You're a fast reader," Lord Vannick guessed. "You can read it all en route." "En route to... Blackmarsh, of course," the tiny fellow giggled. "You're a funny chap. Where else would you go to learn about the work that's being done, and how to improve it?" The next morning, the stack of documentation hardly touched, Decimus Scotti began the journey southeast to Blackmarsh. Lord Vannick had hired an able-bodied guard, a rather taciturn red guard named Malik, to protect his best agent. They rode south along the Niven, and then southeast along the Silverfish, continuing into the wilds of Cyrodiil, where the river tributaries had no names, and the very vegetation seemed to come from another world than the nice, civilized gardens of the northern imperial province. Scotti's horse was tied to Malik's, so the clerk was able to read. It made it difficult to pay attention to the path they were taking, but Scotti knew he needed at least a cursory familiarity with the Commission's business dealings in Blackmarsh. It was a huge box of paperwork, going back 40 years, when the Commission had first been given several million in gold by a wealthy trader, Lord Zellicles Pinos Ravina, to improve the conditions of the road from Gideon to Cyrodiil. At that time, it took 3 weeks, a preposterously long time, for the rice and root he was importing to arrive, half-rotten, in the imperial province. Pinos Ravina was long dead, but many other investors over the decades, including Pelagius IV himself, had hired the commission to build roads, drain swamps, construct bridges, devise anti-smuggling systems, hire mercenaries, and, in short, do everything that the greatest empire in history knew would work to aid trade with Blackmarsh. According to the latest figures, the result of this was that it took 2.5 months for goods, now thoroughly rotten, to arrive. Scotty found that when he looked up after concentrating on what he was reading, the landscape had always changed, always dramatically, and always for the worse. "This is Blackwood, sir," said Malik to Scotty's unspoken question. It was dark and woodsy, so Decimus Scotty thought that was a very appropriate name. The question he longed to ask, which in due course he did ask, was, "What's that terrible smell?" "Sloth Point, sir," Malik replied as they turned the next bend, where the umbrageous tunnel of tangled trees and vine opened to a clearing. There squatted a cluster of formal buildings in the dreary imperial design favored by Lord Vannick's commission and every emperor since Tiber, together with a stench so eye-blindingly, stomach-wrenchingly awful that Scotty wondered, suddenly, if it were deadly poisonous. The swarms of blood-colored, sand-grain-sized insects obscuring the air did not improve the view. Scotty and Malik batted at the buzzing clouds as they rode their horses towards the largest of the buildings, which on approach revealed itself to be perched at the edge of a thick black river. From its size and serious aspect, Scotty guessed it to be the Census and Excise office for the wide white bridge that stretched across the burbling dark water to the reeds on the other side. It was a very nice, bright, sturdy-looking bridge, built, Scotty knew, by his commission. A poxy, irritable official opened the door quickly on Scotty's first knock. Come in quickly! Don't let the flesh flies in!" "Flesh flies?" Decimus Scotty trembled. "You mean they eat human flesh?" "If you're fool enough to stand around and let them," the soldier said, rolling his eyes. He had half an ear, and Scotty, looking around at the other soldiers in the fort, noted that they were all well chewed. One of them had no nose at all to speak of. "Now, what's your business?" Scotty told them, and added that if they stood outside the fortress instead of inside, they might catch more smugglers. "You better be more concerned with getting across that bridge," the soldier sneered. "Tide's coming up, and if you don't get a move on, you won't get to Blackmarsh for 4 days." That was absurd. A bridge, swamped by a rising tide on a river? Only the look in the soldier's eyes told Scotty that he wasn't joking. Upon stepping out of the fort, he saw that the horses, evidently tired of being tortured by the flesh flies, had ripped free of their restraints and were bounding off into the woods. The oily water of the river was already lapping on the planks, oozing between the crevices. Scotty reflected that perhaps he would be more than willing to endure a wait of 4 days before going to Blackmarsh, but Malik was already running across. Scotty followed him, wheezing. He was not in excellent shape, and never had been. The box of commission materials was heavy. Halfway across, he paused to catch his breath, and then discovered that he could not move. His feet were stuck. The black mud that ran through the river was a thick, gluey paste, and having washed over the plank Scotty was on, it held his feet fast. Panic seized him. Scotty looked up from his trap and saw Malik leaping from plank to plank ahead of him, closing fast on the reeds on the other side. "Help!" Scotty cried. "I'm stuck!" Malik did not even turn around, but kept jumping. "I know, sir. You need to lose weight." Scotty knew he was a few pounds over, and had meant to start eating less and exercising more, but embarking on a diet hardly seemed to promise timely aid in his current predicament. And no diet on Nirn would have helped him just then. However, on reflection, Scotty realized that the Red Guard intended that he drop the box of documents, for Malik was no longer carrying any of the essential supplies he had had with him previously. With a sigh, Scotty threw the box of commission notes into the glop and felt the plank under him rise 1/4 of an inch, just enough to free him from the mud's clutches. With an agility born of extreme fear, Scotty began leaping after Malik, dropping onto every third plank and springing up before the river gripped him. In 46 leaps, Decimus Scotty crashed through the reeds onto the solid ground behind Malik and found himself in Blackmarsh. He could hear behind him a slurping sound as the bridge and his container of important and official records of commission affairs was consumed by the rising flood of dark filth, never to be seen again.